It's very good to be with you all. I have super enjoyed hearing from Matt, enjoyed hearing from Amy, and have enjoyed a lot of the conversations with you all. So hopefully, over the next couple of days, if I haven't yet met you, I would love to get the opportunity to meet you. Any questions you might have, I'll try to answer. If you are a note taker, feel free to take notes. But if you're like me and you don't like taking notes, but you like to have notes, I'm posting all my slides from this right there at go.drkevinyoung.com/beyond. And so I'll put that back up on the screen at the very end. One other thing, housekeeping before we get started. I don't usually speak about this topic. In fact, I'm not sure that I've ever spoken about this topic. This is a little personal, and I don't usually talk about myself. I don't like talking about myself. But whenever Ryan called and said, would you talk about this? I said, for you, yes. For anyone else, no. So this is a one-time presentation. So if it's good, sorry, you're the only ones that get to hear it. And if it's terrible, well, that's good. Nobody else will have to hear it. I thought, though, before we get started, that we might pray. And so what I want us to do is I want us to do a kind of traditional Quaker prayer. And so I want you to begin is by just kind of relaxing in your chair. Just center yourself where you are. Find a comfortable position, preferably resting your arms maybe on your legs, or if it's more comfortable, resting your arms on the table in front of you. But get into a position where you feel centered, where you feel relaxed. Feet flat on the ground. And I want you to notice your breathing. Go ahead and close your eyes and just notice your breathing. As you quiet your heart and quiet your soul and center your mind and your heart on the breath of life that God has given to us. Now I want you to take your palms, eyes still closed, sitting comfortably, and I want you to turn your palms face down. I want you to allow yourself to reflect for just a moment on what you are carrying with you today. Maybe this morning you've brought with you a concern. Maybe there's some anxiety about ministry or family or finances. Perhaps something that's weighing on your heart and mind. And I want you to bring that to the forefront of your mind. Now, as you continue to hold your palms down, I want those downward-facing palms to be symbolic of your desire to turn this over to God. Letting go. Dropping it to the ground. I want you to inwardly just pray a prayer of letting go. When you're ready to move on, I want you to turn your palms now face up. Our palms facing up are a symbol of our desire to receive something new in place of what we have let go of. So in your mind, I want you to articulate to God whatever heart's desire is for the one who loves you to give to you generously. What is it that you need? Listen as you breathe for what it may be that God wants to give you or what you need from Him. And as we come to the end of our moment of prayer together, relax your posture. Give thanks to God. Amen. So I need to give you a bit of a trigger warning beforehand. I have the problem of not really being able to filter what I say. So if I say something that is offensive, I'm sorry. You can tell me afterwards, and I will try to never do it again. Part of the reason I think why sometimes I have an inability to control what I say is because, one, I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Indiana. Now we live in South Florida, but also I grew up an independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptist, which means I didn't see a movie in the movie theater until I was in high school. No dancing, no playing cards, all of the rules. If you believe that God sends people to hell, we believed that God was sending everybody to hell but us. Even other Baptists were going to hell. Sorry, sucks to be you. It's just the way that it was. So I went to a Baptist school for college, Cedarville University, which is in Dayton, Ohio, and I wasn't really sure what God wanted me to do with my life. And so I wasn't sure whether it was media, technology, or whether it was ministry. And so I figured by the end of college, I would figure out what God wanted me to do, but I ended up with 2 double majors and had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I just kept going to school. Moved to Texas, to Dallas Seminary, and started working in a Southern Baptist church there, which meant that now I was going to hell because I was in a Southern Baptist church. They ordained me. My family essentially disowned me. It's a really big problem. You could tell, though, that I grew up conservative, but I'm moving away from that conservatism with my life. Really, I was just kind of off the radar of my family when after that I took my first job, real job in a church, post-education, in a Willow Creek model church, a seeker-sensitive church in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where Ryan and I met. It was there that I began to kind of see this confluence of my 2 great loves, ministry and media. One of the things that I have noticed over the years is that God oftentimes takes puzzle pieces from the past that we didn't know why they were there, and at some point in the future, down the road, puts those puzzle pieces into place. I'm not a very patient person, though, so I don't like waiting to see the picture. From there, I realized, though, that I was kind of running from God in senior pastor ministry because I was fearful. I was really afraid of the problems and the pain that come in being in senior pastor ministry. So I stopped running and went to Cleveland, Ohio to work in an evangelical Quaker church, which is where that Quaker prayer comes from. By this point, my family has no idea what's going on with me. They don't understand me. They don't understand the journey that I'm on. I don't understand me, and I don't understand the journey that I'm on. It was a crazy experience. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. We ended up being one of the fastest growing churches in those years, but that all kind of came to an end whenever one of our staff members committed suicide by jumping from our building about 15 minutes before a worship service in front of our children's facility. And so that began a journey of me beginning to reflect and question, and begin to kind of look back through all of my theologies to see where perhaps things had gone wrong for me and where God was in all of this. So I took a year or 2 off from ministry, finished working on a doctorate, got to work. Some of you will recognize his name. He's a Methodist with Lynn Sweet. Incredible guy. Radically changed my outlook on a lot of things. And from there, moved to South Florida where we are now to begin to work in a church. It was a progressive church, but had some trouble. Whenever we got there, I gave him a survey. Some of you may have heard of this, but it's called a Reveal survey. And it basically questions your church about their spiritual health and how they live that out in their daily life. And it puts your church into one of 8 categories. You want to be on the upper right, which is a vibrant church. But if you're not, there are other categories under that that are perhaps less healthy or less practicing of their spiritual gifts. We were at the 8th and lowest category as a church, troubled. Tomorrow, Brian McLaren will get here, and I am so excited because Brian McLaren, the last time that I was in the same room with Brian McLaren, he was speaking at this church during one of our times of deepest trouble. In fact, on the day that Brian McLaren spoke in our church, the church split in the business meeting after Brian McLaren's speech. Now, it wasn't because of Brian, but I will say that I've only ever been in a church split where Brian McLaren was present. So I don't know how much blame that he holds, but I think part of the problem was the church, in fact, the data said was spiritually stalled, but they didn't know it, which is a really terrible place to be as a pastor. Said they're not exploring anything. They're happy where they are, and they have no desire to grow. They're on a journey to nowhere. I spent years trying to ignite a fire underneath that congregation. We were starting to see some progress until COVID hit. Now, I'm sure all of us here have a story about COVID and its effects on ministry, on family, on church, on your profession. It was a difficult time. You know, as I was kind of mapping out this timeline, it was amazing to me, though, that it wasn't just COVID. It was then George Floyd immediately after that. Then a summer of protests over Black Lives Matter, and then counter-protests, and then the election that shall not be named, and then January 6th. And it felt like the wheels were falling out again, not just underneath my church, but also now it felt like the wheels were falling out from underneath me. I was thankful to have had a lot of therapy through the trauma of some of the ministry difficulties of the past. But what I realized was, by the time I got to George Floyd, I realized that I had more work to do, not internally, but I had a lot of work that I needed to do externally. George Floyd wrecked me. Until George Floyd, I couldn't use the word privilege. I understood what it meant, but I didn't see how I had it. Now I can see as a white guy, I have more privilege than I know what to do with, and it's not fair. So when we come to the end of all of these events, I realize that over the course of those ministry years, my church, my ministry, and I were in misalignment. Mostly because the guy who had shown up 4 years earlier was no longer the pastor of that church. I had changed. In my eyes, I had grown. In their eyes, we had grown apart. That happens sometimes when values change. That happens sometimes when our passions change. That happens sometimes when our skills change. But many of us will find ourselves in this moment or in some future moment in misalignment. The difficulty is that pastors and ministry workers can stay in misalignment forever, right? We have a great ability to ignore and avoid rather than to ignite problems, right? We're there to try to keep peace rather than create conflict. And so recognizing and admitting misalignment is admitting perhaps that we have some ownership in that. If not in the cause of it, at least in the necessity of fixing it. And I'm so glad that Amy mentioned risk. The reason why pastors and ministry workers and leaders stay in misalignment forever is because at the end of the day, we are no longer risk-taking individuals. Many of us began in our ministry, began in our lives, began in our youth being risk takers. We would look at ministry leaders like who we are now, and we would say, I will never become that. I will never do it that way. I will never treat people that way. I'm going to take risks. I'm going to do what it takes to change the world. But then you get into some of those positions as you're beginning to climb the ladder, and you move from risk-taking to risk management. And at some point or other, somewhere around, I think, my age, in your mid-40s, you get to the point where you are now risk-averse. You try to avoid risk at all costs. As your age increases, as your tenure increases, that tends to define us. So I misaligned. I don't like taking risks. What do? Well, I pulled out a piece of paper, and I did something that will be old school to a lot of you. I did a SWOT analysis. I said, what do I do about this? So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So I'm looking at the church, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I handle this? What are our strengths? Well, out of all the churches in the world that could have had me, they have the privilege of getting me. And you don't know me, so I could say that. Don't laugh, Ryan. Ryan does know me. It's not the place to laugh. Threats or weaknesses. Let's go there. Weaknesses. Right? It should have been obvious. Sometimes self-awareness is the most important thing that we can bring to the table of our ministries. Our congregations pray for self-awareness. Our spouses pray for self-awareness. Please, God, open their eyes, right? Open his eyes. Open her eyes. Let them see. I and you are probably the greatest gifts that your ministry has. God has placed you there. I believe that called you there. But you also, and I also, am the greatest liability, especially if we're in unhealthy places or if we're misaligned. So, threats as well. The greatest threat is me. But we as ministry workers oftentimes are most concerned about the practical. Where are the opportunities? How do we fix this? How do I fix this? That's the real question mark. Where do we go from here? And this is the one that stops me every time. Is I can know what to do, but the fear of the consequences of change are debilitating. So I stall, and I don't do anything. Harvard Business Review did research that said that a culture of fear is the biggest roadblock to innovation. Most churches live in cultures of fear, and it's getting worse. The tension outside of these walls is tough. The United Methodists, you all know what you have faced and what you have walked through now for years. And it can be debilitating to know where to go from here. What do we do? How do we manage all of this misalignment within our denominations and with each other? On the macro level, but also even on the micro level. In 2014, Harvard Business Review went on to say about fear these three things, that these are the markers of leaders who have fear. Why are they stalled? They fear making a mistake, they fear getting fired, and they fear difficult clients. This is so often us in leadership in our churches and in our ministries. Why don't we act? We don't want to do something wrong. We've given blood, sweat, and tears to this thing, but also this isn't just practical. This isn't just widgets and dollars. This is soul care. This is God's work. What happens if we mess up? What happens if we make a mistake or if we do something wrong and people walk away? How do we live with that burden? And so we stall and we wait until we're certain, and the certainty never seems to come. Fear of getting fired. Many of us worry about what that looks like. Fear of difficult clients. Maybe for pastors, this is why online church is so great. You never have to see them. But it drives, right? It drives our decisions. Sometimes that's a good thing, and other times it just simply isn't. So strengths, weaknesses, threats, opportunities. I realized that the biggest opportunity in that situation, in this situation, was me. Now, some of you will know Taylor Swift. This is on in my household with our 4 kids all the time. It's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. I realized the greatest opportunity was me. I had strengths and weaknesses, and I was a threat, but really the only person that I could fix was me. The only person that could really change, other than maybe God, but God probably working through me, was the only way that things were going to begin to turn around and align and become healthy again. So can anybody name what the name of this song is that this is from? Anti-Hero, yes. The Swifties in the house. So anti-hero is a thing. Those of you who are literary or English experts may know this, but an anti-hero is a person who is a hero but is not your typical hero. So an anti-hero is a hero who does not exhibit any of the traditional qualities of heroism. Oftentimes in movies, in stories, in books, there will be an anti-hero, someone who is a hero but doesn't exhibit all the qualities of that. Can you think of some off the top of your head? Okay. Another one? Okay. Another one? That one hit close to home. Okay. Others? All right. Another one? See, the thing about an anti-hero is this, is that somehow, even though they don't have all of the traditional qualities, maybe it's courage or bravery or someone who's really smart or the most spiritually centered person in the room, if we can take this into spiritual terms. Somehow or other, though, they overcome things that traditionally would be seen as flaws in order to radically change the story for the better. The Bible is filled with anti-heroes, right? What I love about Scripture is that Scripture oftentimes paints such a bleak picture of the spiritual and actual relational qualities of people in Scripture that you would say that this person would never be someone who God would use. Samson. He has strength, but that's about it, right? An anti-hero. Statistically, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Enneagram, but statistically, most senior ministers are one of 2 Enneagram numbers. Anyone want to hazard a guess at what? Have you all heard this? Did Amy say this? Okay. Smartest people in the room here. I love it. 3s and 8s. I'm not a 3 or an 8. I don't know why it's funny, but I'm a 9. I'm a peacemaker. What I realize, though, is that peace comes through conflict, and so I look like an 8 a lot. because I realized that as an anti-hero, I could actually bring about peace through a different way, through conflict. And it was in those moments where I realized, even though I didn't have everything that this other pastor had, I didn't have all of the resources that this church had, I didn't have all of the skills or education that this individual has, God could still use me, who I am, where I am, to do great things. And so it was in that moment where I began to understand something that came from another pastor in a conference like this about a decade and a half ago in my life, this idea of holy discontent. This thing within myself that gnawed at me and nagged at me. The illustration that he used was Popeye saying, "I've had all I can stand and I can't stand no more." And I think that so oftentimes we become misaligned, we stop taking risks, we stall out in fear because we're concerned that what we have this holy discontent within ourselves about isn't worth passionately pursuing. One of the things I love about this group and this conference, and those of you who represent the United Methodist Church as someone who is an outsider of the UMC, is I am thankful that God has given a significant number of you a holy discontent about how we treat the LGBTQIA plus community. It's a gift. It's a gift to that community. It's a gift to the church. It's a gift to those who are outside of the UMC. And I'm thankful that enough people had a holy discontent about that to draw a line in the sand and say, we are going to fight for this and hold on to this, even if we have to walk through conflict and pain in order to hold on to that value. This is holy discontent that drives us to do the right thing, that drives us to, in a word, innovate because we have to. Because the systems and the things that we have built around us that once were life-giving and resource-building and growth-inducing now are liabilities. And so that holy discontent drives us to change what must change, to do what must be done, not because it's the easy way, not because it's not a risky path, but because doing that or accomplishing that is more important than anything that we might face. Along the way. So I'm misaligned, fearful. I'm not sure what to do. And I remembered that on that day that Brian McLaren split our church, I wouldn't have said that if he were here. He sat in my office beforehand, and he was asking me about our church and what we're doing, and was telling him that our church is trying to be a third-way church, in the middle, bringing together two sides of any issue, but specifically at that time, in those years, it was about the LGBT conversation, and that we were trying to bring together both sides and be in the middle. And as Brian is prone to doing, he sat there and listened intently and then just kind of stared off into space for a moment. And he kind of looked me in the eyes, and as gently as he could, but I still took offense, as gently as he could, he said, at some point or other, you're going to have to get off the fence. And I was like, no, that's not what we do. We bring people together. That's what we do in church. That's what we do in ministry. We don't cause waves. He said, at some point or other, you're going to have to get off the fence. And he said, I'll tell you why. Because some issues are too important not to. And it wrecked me. And I think about that over and over and over again. Whenever I face a crisis, whenever I face a problem, whenever I face something in the context of ministry that I'm doing, I always ask myself, is this one where I should be riding the fence? Where I should be bringing people together? This is a uniting issue? Or is this an issue? Is this something that is so important that the holy discontent that God has given to me is so on fire, so alive that I have to speak up and speak out. I have to take a stand. I have to do a certain thing, and I know there are going to be people who aren't going to like it when I do. And then I start seeing their faces. I start thinking of their names. I can say exactly what they're going to say, and I realize that I don't have a choice because I have been placed in a position where I have to make those kinds of decisions. I'm not just here to steward a paycheck. I'm here to shepherd. I'm here to make a difference. At the end of the day, when I look back, when people look back, I don't want them to say, well, I do want them to say he was a nice guy, but I know they're not going to say that. I want them to say he did things. He stood for what was right, or what he thought was right. And he tried to stand with God. He was willing to take risks. I want my kids to see that and to know that I was willing to risk to do the right thing, even if that brought harm and difficulty for us as a family. And so I walked away. I walked away from the institutional church. I got off the fence and I said, I just can't do this anymore. I love God. I love ministry. I'm gifted. I'm overeducated. I'm really skilled. I'm actually really good at this job, but I can't stand the church anymore. I had some things I needed to work through, clearly. But I began listening. And as I listened to people, I realized that a lot of other people were frustrated with the church as well. Most of my friends who had gone to Christian college with, almost all of them, dozens, weren't involved in church anymore. And I had no idea. Carried on conversations with people. We're Facebook friends, instant messaged each other, texted all the time. And I hadn't asked, wasn't paying attention, and they sure didn't want to tell me, but they'd walked away from church. But what I realized when I began listening and having conversations is they hadn't given up on God. They hadn't given up on Jesus, but they felt like the church had given up on them. And so what were they to do? So I moved online. And I said, if these people are never going to walk into a church again, then we'll do what we did in COVID and just stay online and see if it's an opportunity for us to bring the church to where people are. We don't have to knock on their door, as Matt said, right? We can show up on their computer screen if they want us. So we started doing that. What I realized in doing that was the church is in desperate need of innovating. I was in desperate need of innovating. And I love this verse in Esther, and I know it's not written to me. I know it's very contextual. But if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for your people will arise from another place, and who knows but that you have come to your position for such a time as this. And those puzzle pieces began falling into place. The love for technology, all of that training experience, years working in media ministry before coming to the pastorate. All those things began to fall into place as God began to use those things in my life every day. And I would say, oh, that's why that puzzle piece was there. Oh, that's why I needed that. Matt talked a lot about Sunday mornings, and I hope he'll forgive me, but if your church is anything like many other churches, Sunday mornings are tough. Since 1993, Sunday morning church attendance has dropped by 1/3. Projections over the coming decades by more than one research firm says it's only going to get worse. Now, I know that we need to be talking about hope, and we'll get there, but sometimes we have to kind of face the reality, because oftentimes what happens is we know Sunday morning is the engine that runs the wheel of the church, and so there's a tendency for us, whenever things get tough, to continue to dump resources, people, energy, money into the thing that drives the system. And pastors and ministry workers love Sunday mornings. I'm not going to tell you to stop doing Sunday mornings. I'm also not going to tell you to stop resourcing Sunday mornings. But what I am going to suggest to you is this, is that begin to consider this idea of defocusing on Sundays in order to refocus elsewhere. What steps can you make in order to see your ministry as being more than just Sunday morning? And if you see Sunday morning as most important, maybe begin to see others as being as equally important as Sunday morning ministry. Secondly, give tools to navigate faith without you. One of the difficulties that I found whenever I walked away from doing institutional church ministry full time is that oftentimes the church holds people's hands through everything. Come to our small group. Join our class. Bring your kids so that we can have this program for them. Come serve missions with us. We place ourselves in the center of people and their relationship with God, and people are pushing away. They're not pushing away from God, they're not pushing away from Jesus, but oftentimes they're pushing away from Big Brother. Some of that is because we've just been a little too overbearing. Other times, though, it's because they're just too busy. Things have changed. Sunday mornings aren't protected anymore. Sports happen on Sunday mornings. COVID, people realize, you know what? It's really fun to sleep in on Sunday mornings. Sometimes I'll pre-record my service just so I can sleep in on Sunday mornings. Shh, don't tell. Give them tools to navigate faith without you. So since we weren't seeing people every week, and since online people are all over the U.S. and all over the world, we realized we have no ability to invite them to a program. We have no ability to really bring them in on a Sunday morning. Maybe they're watching, maybe they're not. Maybe they're watching at some other point during the week. We realized, though, that what we needed to do was we needed to begin to equip them to own their spiritual journey. The church knows this. We as pastors know this, but we don't do this. Why? Because we love Sunday mornings. We love Vacation Bible School. We love these traditional things that the church does, and the people who come to church that we see on Sunday mornings are always wanting more of those things. So to do that, we had this idea if we're going to be sending things to people's homes, let's do essentially a subscription box. So we pulled a book, wrote a Bible study, we put a gift or two in the box, something for the kids, and we sent it to anybody who was connected with us. And we did them kind of by theme. One month we talked about safe spaces. And so we put in a book about safe spaces, wrote a Bible study about safe spaces, and sent coffee to them. The next month, we did one on the Enneagram. And so we sent a book about the Enneagram. We put together a Bible study where we wrote every week, we'd do a different Enneagram number, and then we plugged in Bible characters who most likely had that Enneagram number. And so that was our Bible study. Well, how do you do Bible study? Well, we encourage them to do it on their own with their families around their table. But we also, live every morning, 8:30, get online, and anybody who wants to be led in Bible study can be on and can do that. And so it's an ability for us to resource them and encourage them to do it on their own. We send them materials to help them lead their kids in doing it. And we've found that has been very important to us because one of the things that is going to be needful to changing the trajectory of our churches and the spiritual health of the people who are connected is to refocus on orthopraxy over orthodoxy. What does that mean? Orthopraxy is right practice or spiritual practice. Orthodoxy is right belief. The church oftentimes has focused, I don't want to say too much, but it's focused so much on doctrine and belief that they have forgotten spiritual practices or the importance of spiritual practices. So the stats are staggering and are anywhere available, but this one shows that for those who are in Gen Z, our youth, those green ones are all other teens. The committed Christians are in the purple. But what you see here is that normal teenagers who aren't strong in their faith, so weak in their faith or have no faith at all, Christians are no longer experts and church leaders are no longer experts to them. Whenever they're looking for spiritual direction or spiritual advice, they're not going to go to a church, to a Christian. They're going to go to their family. But if we were to look statistically, we would find that families and parents feel so ill-equipped spiritually that if their kid was to come to them and have a spiritual question, they wouldn't know how to answer it. We have to begin to change that. And decades of focusing on Sunday mornings hasn't changed that. This says essentially the same thing. For the first 350 years or so of the church, there was no Bible. Now we think that, okay, once the Bible came along, everybody had a Bible. Well, that didn't really happen until the printing press. It took 1,000 years or so for Bibles to infiltrate into churches. When the Bible eventually came along 350 years or so after Jesus, cathedrals might have a Bible. Local parishes, local churches didn't have a Bible. It took several hundred years for them to begin to show up in local churches. And when they did, they were chained to the pulpit so that they couldn't be stolen. But when we look at the early church, what we find is they had a spiritual revival, the likes of which we've never really seen since. When you look at the early church, those first few hundred years is the time of greatest growth in the church. How did they do that without a Bible? They did it through spiritual practices, by encouraging people to live, to act out their faith like we did with a prayer. They created the church calendar, the liturgical calendar. They would pray regularly the hours of the day. So sunrise, sunset, noon, sometimes others in addition to that. They would have dinners, meals. They would feast. In fact, communion wasn't 5 minutes in a service. They would sit around tables like this and have food and talk about faith and communion was a part of that meal. They would fast. They began to set up examples for their kids of heroes of the faith. They would say, if you're not sure what it looks like to have a great, strong relationship with Jesus, look at this person. Look at them. Watch what they do. That's what Paul said. Follow me as I follow Christ. They would utilize creeds, short statements of belief that could be easily memorized and recited. They would use catechism in order to teach people what some of the foundational doctrines. They wouldn't just say, hey, go read your Bible. They'd say, here, these are some really important beliefs that you need to hold on to. Pilgrimage, they would go places and experience, and rites of passage, communion, baptism, Easter. So they utilize these things in order to embed faith in new converts to Christianity and into their kids. We come now to a culture that is not just no longer a Christian culture, if it ever were, but it's not the 1950s. Things have changed. There's no social pressure to go to church or to pretend. And so we come to a culture that is very much like the culture that the early church found itself in, pagan, antagonistic towards Jesus and towards faith. And so they utilize these things. And so I might ask, how might you rethink some of these things in your own context in order to help support what you're doing on Sunday mornings, in order to help undergird the teaching of your doctrine and the Bible? How might you raise up examples of faith, saints in your church, in your family, in your context? How might you utilize mentoring? What about pilgrimage? Are there important sites or places in your church's context or in your family's context even? My grandparents' house was extremely important in my spiritual formation. The church that I grew up in, even though I wouldn't go there now, was extremely important to my spiritual formation. These are things that I want my kids to experience. I want them to see my grandparents' house. I want them to see the place where I went to church. I want them to experience the place where I found Jesus. What about rites of passage? We have rites of passage, right? Driver's license, Sweet 16 birthday party, entering the draft, voting, 18, 21, first drink. What rites of passage does the church have? Confirmation, third grade Bibles, kindergarten Bibles. We have some. Are they enough? What about your adolescents? 70% of adolescents walk away from church and never walk back in when they graduate. What are we doing for them? What are we doing rites of passage-wise? What can we do? And overemphasize online. And with this, we're done. A few months ago, I jumped back onto Twitter after not being on Twitter for a long time. Had 500 followers, and now something like 13,000. It's crazy. Like, I tell people how many people follow me on Twitter, and they're like, how did that happen? I say, I have absolutely no idea. But I think that what happened there is I showed up online and I was saying things that nobody else was saying. And part of that is because I have a tendency to do that, to just say things nobody else is willing to say. But also because I was in a space where it didn't matter what I said. And I was in a ministry context where I could be free to say what I wanted without any repercussions. And so it allowed me to talk about LGBTQ issues without worrying. It allowed me to talk about racism and white supremacy without worrying. It gave me the freedom to speak freely. And what I recognized and realized was my voice resonates with people who are evangelical, who have walked away from the church, people who are agnostic or atheists. And so oftentimes now on Twitter, like I get a lot of crap from people because they're like, the atheists like you must be doing something wrong. I'm like, isn't this who we're trying to reach? I don't want the Christians to like what I'm saying. I don't like the Christians. I actually like the atheists more. They're nicer. They don't have all the hurts and habits and actually they do. Frankly, most people who are atheists, I'm finding, were evangelical Christians who got so wounded and so harmed that they said, I can only walk away from church. I just don't believe there's a God anymore. And what I found was when I started listening and talking freely and just asking questions, is that resonated with a group of people who thought that no pastor or no Christian had anything to say that they wanted to hear anymore. Now, you're not going to jump on Twitter probably and have that same experience, but what I will say is that you have a voice that resonates somewhere. You have experiences, you have gifts, you have skills, you have holy discontent that are unique. What are those things? Find and identify those things and then begin to innovate ways to get your voice heard. And I want to encourage you to find ways to do it online. My kids, your grandkids have one thing in their hand all the time, right? They're not going to church, but their face is buried in this. The opportunities are endless. Now, maybe Twitter isn't your thing. Maybe it's Facebook. Maybe it's TikTok. Maybe it's Snapchat. I don't know what it is, but I want to encourage you to take risks. I want to encourage you to not be fearful. And if you fail, try something new. Risk and innovation. Without risk, there can be no innovation. What is it that you have always wanted to do, but never have the guts to do it? What is it? And I believe that there are many of us here this morning who you have had something deep within yourself that you know what that thing is, you want to do it. You're like, is that you, God, or is that me? Is that selfish? Is that vanity? Is it spiritual? You don't even want to talk about it because you're fearful of giving it voice. Will mean you've got to take a risk to do it, that somebody will say, hey, you should do that. And then what are you going to do, right? What is that thing? And so for the next couple of minutes, I want us at our tables to talk about those things. Now, most of us probably are at tables where we don't know the people who are there outside of this conference. That's a really good thing, right? Because you're never going to see these people again. So you can be honest. You can say, hey, here's this thing. What do you think? I've never told this to anybody else. Tell it. What is your holy discontent? Or maybe you need to work on this question. What would your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats be? Or what innovation ideas do you have that are risky?